Ellis B. Feaster's Radio Aircheck and Classic TV channel.
I can't think of anybody who made comedies during the 30s and 40s and 50s, who are any better liked than the Three Stooges. Where are you from?
Brooklyn, New York.
Is Moe Howard your real name?
Yes. Middle name Harry, but I never use it. I did use it years ago and left out the Moe. I didn't use Moe until I joined with Healy.
A lot of people would be interested in knowing how long, to begin with, you've been part of the Three Stooges and how they began.
Well, first of all, I'd like to request that you call me Moe in preference to Mr. Howard. Fortunately, I know that people know me as Mr. Howard only in my social life. Out into left field, it's just Moe in every direction. The Three Stooges was a development, you see. It wasn't planned as an organization. I started with a fellow called Ted Healy in 1922. He was a boyhood friend of mine, and he traveled off into one end of show business while I was in another. And we got together and worked along for about a year. Then my older brother, Shemp, joined with us, made it Two Stooges. And it happened in a very funny way. I used to come from the audience and work with Healy. I'd give him a note of reference and a recommendation, and just praised myself to the sky, told him I sang like Gallikerchi, and he says, well, Gallikerchi's a woman, and I would say, oh, I know that, And finally, I heard my brother Shemp laugh in the audience. So I whispered to Ted, I said, Ted, Shemp's out there. So he stepped to the footlights and says, I'd like to have another young man come up here, preferably from Brooklyn. And sure enough, Shemp came up. Then we had a little tangle too there. He came up eating a pear and asked Ted if he wanted it. Ted said no, so he pushed it in his face, and there was a whole wrestle going on. That then became two. That was in 1922. And we traveled along that way until late in 22. Ted took his brother-in-law in as a third man because his wife had asked him to give him a job of some kind. He was very inexperienced, and so inexperienced that it became funny only to us, see. So that traveled along for about 4 months, and Ted couldn't stand that any longer. So it was Shemp and I until early 1925 when we picked up Larry.
Now, at this point, were you actually being billed as the Two Stooges?
Oh, no. It was Ted Healy and the boys at that time. And Larry was working in a nightclub in Chicago. He had left his wife and sister-in-law, who were doing a singing and dancing flash act, they used to call those in vaudeville. And he had some kind of a beef with his wife and sister-in-law, and they broke it up. He wasn't getting the proper billing, you see. Once they call it the Haney Sisters and Fine, and then they call it the Haney Sisters and Company. He didn't like that, you see. So we saw him entertaining there, and I turned to Ted. We watched him that night. He was doing a Russian dance in tails and a high hat and playing a fiddle at the same time. So we could see through that pretty much. So when he went to his dressing room, we went back there and asked him if he would care to join up with the Stooges. So I said, yeah, I'd love it. So Healy says, I'll give you $90 a week and $10 extra if you put that violin away. So that became three in 1925. Then we were called Ted Healy and his gang, Ted Healy and his Three Southern Gentlemen, Ted Healy and his Racketeers. At one time, he must have had about 12 Stooges on the stage at one time. It was like a three-ring circus. And that was the getting together of the three originals, my brother Shemp, I, and Larry. Then in 1932, my brother Shemp got the opportunity to play the character Nobby in the Joe Palooka picture. And we said, you go ahead. Don't worry anything about it. We'll get the young brother, whom we called Babe. His name was Jerome. And We called them Curley. So that's when Curley came into the picture in 1932. So it was Moe, Larry, and Curley from 1932 to 1946, when Curley became very ill. And Shemp rejoined us from 1946. Curley passed away in 52, and then Shemp passed away in 55.
What had Shemp been doing in the meantime?
Oh, he was under contract to Universal. He was at MGM. Did some great parts. Several times he did parts that were completely silent, only in pantomime. Great. And but he was anxious to get back into the set with us, you know. Was more carefree. He was a hard study, you know. He got into the habit of, when we got into a scene and one of us would talk, he would lip the same dialogue, you know. His mouth would keep moving his lips. And when you see it in the dailies, you know, in the rushes, we'd look and the director was saying, what's Shemp saying? He studied so hard that he knew everybody's part. And he talked it along with him, you know. So we got him out of that habit. Took quite some time. So Shemp passed away in 55. Of course, Curley lingered for 6 years, and Shemp went out of the picture in about 30 seconds.
What? How did you get into movies? When did that begin?
For me, it began in 1908, when I was a young boy. So, oh yes, I was in many, many films. From 1908 to 1911, I must have been in 40 or 50 films.
Where were they made at that time?
At the Vitagraph Company in Brooklyn, off on the Brighton line, Avenue M and Neck Road, the old Vitagraph studio, which later Warner Brothers bought, and now has become a Jewish seminary for girls. And it was very nostalgic when we did a show for ABC, I think it was, Who's Afraid of Mother Goose? And we shot it on NBC equipment across from the Vitagraph studio. And then when I stood in that corner, I remembered, now this was about 5 years ago, and I remembered back in 1908, when I only attended 13 days out of a semester at school, and the truant officer was looking for me all the time. Never found me, though. And I honed my way into the studio by asking if they wanted me to go for sandwiches for them around lunch hour, you know. And after about 3 or 4 weeks of doing that, the director called me over. It was a boy star called Kenneth Casey. Director was Van Dyke Brooks. He called me and said, would you help us out and do a little bit in the Kenneth Casey picture? I said, sure. Fine. And we were working in an orphanage in Brooklyn then, that picture was. And I did a day's work, and I got a $50, which in those, well, I mean, compared to today, that $50 would probably be $4. Then some pictures I got $1 for, some I got $5. I worked with Maurice Costello, names which you probably haven't heard. I mean...
He was the father of Dolores Costello, a very big stage name.
Oh, yes, he was a matinee idol. And, of course, there was John Bunny and Flora Finch.
I've always wanted to talk with someone who worked with John Bunny. I've never seen him except his pictures, but he looks like the funniest man in the world.
Yeah, he was a pleasant man. He'd laugh a lot. In fact, he spoiled a lot of film by laughing in the wrong places.
Someone told me he really didn't drink. He always looked like he had a snoop
looked like a rum nose. Yeah, he had a nose to match, but he never drank. I ran sandwiches for him. He used to eat sardine sandwiches and a glass of root beer, a carton of root beer. That was his drinking. And Flora Finch, he was short and fat, and she was like a string bean. Wonderful woman, though. And there was Florence Turner, in those days the equal of, what's the one that Howard Hughes made wings with us?
Jean Harlow?
Jean Harlow. She was the Jean Harlow of that day with those deep dimples. And there was Lillian Walker. Florence.
She's still around, Lillian Walker.
Not
She
this
lives
one.
in the... Lillian, she worked for Crest Pictures, was the, she lives down in the Caribbean. She's very old.
Oh, she would have to be very
She
old.
co-starred with Wally Van. Is that the same one?
That's the one.
Well, Wally
Yes.
Van's still around. I see him.
Yeah. Well, that's the one.
She's still with us.
Yeah, that's good. And there was a bunch of other stars that used to work for Vitagraph there. Then I did a little work for Biograph up in the Bronx. After I got accustomed, I went with a couple of independent studios in Red Bank, New Jersey. They had some studios there. Of course, Selig had their studio in Chicago. And Bronco Billy Anderson and the Calum Company came out of Chicago and came to the coast.
What about the shorts that you began making? Was that in the 30s that you started?
Yes, we started originally at MGM. We made 5 two-reel comedies in 1933. And while they were talking about an option, Columbia signed us to a 24-year straight deal, no options. We started there in the early summer of 1934 and finished on January 12, 1958, and made 204 two-reelers, besides features and things like that.
Did you make them over here on the Gower Street lot?
Yes, we made in the early days. They didn't have the ranch in the early days, you see.